Hi, welcome to my podcast, Reclaim. I am your host, Thaís Sky. I have supported women navigate the complexities of being human for over 10 years. This podcast is where I disseminate some of those learnings and offer thoughts and guests to guide you into your healing. Welcome. Hello, beautiful humans. I am back after a few months hiatus. I'm back. Reclaim is back, and I have really exciting plans for episodes for the next few weeks. Lots of things going on. We're about to enter worthiness season. If you've been around the block, you know what worthiness season is. If you have not been around the block, that is okay. You'll learn what worthiness season is soon enough. But I'm so thrilled to be here. I've missed this. I've missed recording. I've missed talking to you all. I missed having opportunities to kind of share my thoughts a little bit more in a nuanced way, the predominant way in which I talk about my work through Instagram. It can be hard to be as nuanced as I like to be. And so my podcast is an opportunity for me to share my thoughts and interview really cool people. And anyway, I'm just glad that you're here. Thanks for listening. I really appreciate you. You know, I know that lots of people say this, but this podcast really would not be possible without you listening and engaging and letting me know your thoughts and sharing with me your takeaways. All of that is really, really meaningful to me. It's why I do this. And so I'm eternally grateful for you all for being here and for listening. Now, before I get into today's topic, I just want to quickly let you know that I created a new meditation. I don't remember the last time I recorded a new meditation, maybe last year. As I announced to everyone on my newsletter list, I took down all of the meditations that you were able to purchase. Now, all of my meditations are only available in my program, Worthy Women Rise. However, because I am just getting a continual sense as we enter this new year that there are so many of us who feel so inadequate and feel like we have to get on the New Year's resolution train and we feel like we have to improve and we have to do so much to create the world and the life we want to create. I'm just feeling a lot of this pressure. I've decided to record a meditation called New Year's Sane Me Meditation, and it's an infusion of worth, an infusion of reminders that you are actually not a self-improvement project and that you can grow and you can look to the future with excitement and build something you really want without it stemming out of a deep sense of brokenness and lack that I think our culture really tries to prey on. So I'm sending out that meditation to my newsletter list tomorrow, Wednesday. You want to be on my newsletter list. You want this meditation. So you can go to thaissky.com/email to get on my newsletter list. Or you can go to the show notes and you'll have the link there. Get on my newsletter list. I'm really excited about this meditation. And once I send it out, it will not be available anywhere. I'm not putting it on my website for sale. So you want to make sure that you get on my newsletter list as soon as possible so you can get that meditation. Okay? Let's get into this week's topic. I want to talk about loneliness. And I'm going to make an argument here. I'm going to build an argument for why I think loneliness and self-trust are in many ways connected. And you may think, wow, that's two very different concepts. And so I hope that by the end of our time together, you will have an understanding of how I see them as more connected than not. And in that knowledge, in that journey that we're about to embark together, maybe you will have a deeper understanding of your own experience of loneliness and what it really means to be lonely, and how cultivating self-trust could be deeply connected to our sense of loneliness. Yes? The reason why I chose loneliness for this first kind of episode of 2022 is because, you know, as a coach and a mental health professional, I am seeing such an increase in people reporting to me that they are feeling tremendously isolated and lonely. And does that surprise anybody? We are about to embark in year 3 of the pandemic, and the pandemic has isolated us with quarantining and with suspicion about other people's behavior, with the news, with increased sensitivity. I mean, we're really seeing an increase in distrust in other people, whether they have a disease that they're about to give us or whether they respect our autonomy, whatever it is, isolation has been a real important aspect of this pandemic. We can see this. We can see how, when we isolate people and we remove people from abilities to connect and share meaningful activities with other humans, or even just be in the space together with other humans, we start to feel an increased sense of isolation. And while I know that there are so many tech people who think that somehow tech can replace social connection, it can't. No amount of social media, no amount of being together on Slack can possibly replace the meaningful experience of being together with other humans. We are, as I'm sure you have heard a bajillion times in a bajillion different ways, social beings. And I want to take it one step further. We're not just social beings. It's not just important for us to be in spaces with other humans. It's not in and of itself enough. How many of us have experienced being in spaces with other humans and feeling intensely lonely, right? I don't think that it's just being in space, though that can be useful, but I think it's also a meaningful connection. So I'm going to take it one step further and say that we're not just social beings, we're relational beings. Our kind of well-being comes out of being in relationship, meaningful, engaging relationships with other humans. And that cannot be replaced by technology. I know that tech is really trying, though, and they're really pushing these platforms to replace, psychotherapy, in-person psychotherapy with text messaging. And I'm going to do a whole episode on that at some point because I have a lot of thoughts on that, but that's not today's episode. We need relationships. I'm speaking broadly. I know that there are probably people out there who's like, actually, I thrive being alone and I thrive being away from people. But I am suspicious. I think that we have convinced ourselves and we have cut off the need of needing other people. That's particularly true in Western culture and our hyper-independence kind of model of being. But I'm suspicious of people who say that they are thriving in isolation. I wonder if what's really happening is isolation feels safer than relationship due to, biopsychosocial impact, right? Based on history, based on experience, that there's something else going on there. Because I'm going to continue to really land, at least from my experience and what I'm seeing and what I'm reading, that we need relationships. And so let's talk about, okay, so if we need relationships and, if the pandemic has cut off our ability to really connect meaningfully with people in a lot of ways, not always, but in a lot of ways, how do we make sense of this isolation and this loneliness and how do we connect that to self-trust? Let's kind of start to build this argument. First, let's really dissect what loneliness is. Now, I want to kind of clarify that there are many ways that we can think about loneliness, and I'm not referring to loneliness as being alone. And I imagine that maybe if you really think about your own experiences of when it was when you were alone, but actually feeling really connected versus lonely, it's a very different feeling, right? There's a lot of what am I trying to say? There's a lot of people out there who will say that like you can't possibly be in relationship with people unless you learn how to be alone. What are they referring to? And is that even, do I agree with that? I think in many ways, I think what that means is that if we can't really land within ourselves and tolerate ourselves, we're going to have a really hard time being in relationship. But I'm not quite convinced that it's that linearly, that we need to like establish some type of utopian relationship with self before we can be in relationship with others. That I'm very dubious about. I think it's more like both things kind of develop simultaneously. As we develop relationship with self, we develop relationship with ourselves and others, and it just kind of bounces back and forth. But anyway, I'm not talking about being alone. I think alone is our ability to be with ourselves. I think when we're speaking of being alone, we're talking about giving our spaces for, like, if we identify as introverted, as spaces to restore and relax. And I think we all can benefit from learning how to be alone and learning how to be with ourselves. And that's I think connected to this idea of loneliness, because what may happen is we're alone for a little bit, for an hour, 2 hours a day. It's feeling really good. And then we start to creep into this feeling of loneliness. So let's define, I'm actually going to look it up right now. Loneliness. Let's see what the internet says loneliness is. Okay, loneliness, according to the internet, is a state of mind linked to wanting human contact but feeling alone. People can be alone but not feel lonely, like what I just said, or they can have contact with people and still experience feelings of isolation. Didn't I just say that? Look at me. It also says here, oh my gosh, they're treating on the Google, they're treating loneliness as like an illness. You know, they have a little thing on the right, like loneliness, feeling sad or unhappy about being socially isolated. And then they have a section here called treatments. What is the treatment to loneliness? Oh God. Oh my goodness. Okay. The treatment to loneliness, according to the Google, volunteering, attending community or religious events, or taking a class may help form new friendships and reduce loneliness. Going for a meal, coffee, or a walk with family or friends may also help. And then it says, seeking medical care, seek emergency help if you are thinking about suicide. I get it. I think the Google is trying to be more thoughtful of thinking of mental health as a part of the medical model, right? Like this is something that there's a treatment for, and then anyway. Common causes of loneliness, according to the Google. So it says loneliness can be normal, and it is only an indicator of underlying disease when feelings become excessive, all-consuming, and interfering with daily living. Oh, good. I'm really glad that we're thinking about loneliness as a potential disease, symptom of a disease. Really good. Okay, we're gonna just move on. Okay, so let me start building the argument that loneliness is directly connected to trust. I like to think of loneliness, the deep kind of despair, sense of disconnect and isolation, where it doesn't matter if we're around people or not. We feel really disconnected. We feel really apart from people. That's the emotion that I'm really referring to right now. I'm not talking about temporary moments of, oh, I feel really lonely. I'm talking about like a more permanent state of being where it really feels like nobody gets us, right? And that we're feeling removed from connection. And that even when we are around people, it just isn't feeling very good, very grounded. I want to pose an idea. This idea comes from a beautiful article by D.W. Winnicott, who was a psychoanalyst and child's therapist, and he wrote a paper called Capacity to Be Alone. And it really stirred my mind and made me think. The article itself doesn't reference loneliness, but it made me really think about, the importance of being able to be alone, as I mentioned before, how it's really, when we're able to be alone and be whole, we're speaking of a very specific psychic experience. And Winnicott attempted to name what what is required in order for us to be able to be alone, but not lonely, right? To be able to be whole in our aloneness, because that is a really important sign of emotional maturity, the capacity to be alone versus collapsing into a loneliness. And so reading his paper and kind of stirred up my own thoughts, and so this is kind of like a hybrid of both of these things. But it's this idea of, what if to be alone meant to actually be able to rest in the presence of an other, and that other is in our mind. So let me back up. What if we learn the capacity to be alone from experiences with our predominant caregiver as children, that the mother, I'm going to use the mother here, but I'm meaning really any predominant caregiver, the mother is able to be alone in the presence of the child, like letting the child be alone in the presence of her. So there is an art to being able to be with another while also resting within ourselves. So it's not impinging. It's not continually demanding that the child pay attention to the mother. I'm thinking right now specifically about like a baby playing in a playpen while the mother is in the room with the baby and like is paying attention to the baby, and the baby is aware that the mother is paying attention, but the mother isn't playing with the child. The child is learning how to play, right? How to shapes and blocks and things and chew and put it in the mouth, right? All of that really cute baby stuff in the presence of an other. They are building an ability to remember, to understand that they are being known, that they are existing in the mind of the other because they are in the presence of an other who's paying attention to them but not impinging in their space. I know that this is very theoretical here, but there's something powerful that gets developed when a child can learn that they can exist in the presence of another, but the other doesn't have to be continually reminding the child that they exist. So it's not necessarily interacting. It's not the mother playing with the child, but the child is able to rest in the presence of the mother. They're able to play, they're learning about themselves, and they're learning about themselves because they are existing in the mind of the mother. If we take that, a small example, if we can all draw into our minds that image of a baby playing alone, but in the presence of the mother, what happens as that child grows? They start to create within themselves a capacity of playing by themselves now. Now let's age the child up a little bit, where they're able to play by themselves in the room, and the mother isn't there physically, but the mother is there internally. That the child has learned that they can be alone in a space, but they're not actually alone. They still exist. The mother in their mind is showing them that they exist. So this is, I know that this is all very heady, but what I'm trying to kind of get at here is that the child has internalized the mother. The child has now brought that mother into the child's mind. And so even though they are physically alone, they are not alone. They are known by an other, and that other is in their mind. Are you following this yet? Are you following this? I think that this is really cool. That if we can think of loneliness in this way, that the capacity to be alone is actually a relational skill where we're learning that as a child and as we grow up, that to be alone really doesn't mean a full void. It actually means that we are physically alone, but in the presence of others in our mind, that mother object, father object, grandparent object are now in their mind. Then what follows from that is that loneliness is a void of that. Loneliness is a sense of total isolation, that there is not a remembering of an other in the mind. that loneliness, potentially, again, this is all theory. Loneliness is a theory of not being known by another, not being able to be held in the mind of another. Because in that very formative moment, right, that we're imagining of a child playing with blocks in the presence of the mother, that the mother is actually absent, not attuned, not emotionally there, available, or impinging, forcing her presence onto the child, not being able to allow the child to be alone because of her own stuff about being alone, about her own state of loneliness and not being able to be known or not feeling known by others. And now the child must be continually now forced to know the mother instead of the mother know the child. What if loneliness is the absence of good people in our minds, right? The absence of really being able to bring in others in our minds. And I'm not talking about like, oh, I know there's good people out in the world. I'm talking about emotional knowing. So, okay, if we were to imagine loneliness in this very esoteric kind of theoretical way, that loneliness is to not have an internal other, right? Then it follows that loneliness is a state of not trusting that others can keep us in mind because we can't keep others in mind. We're not holding another person in our minds. That's loneliness, right? I just built that. Loneliness is we don't have other people in our minds because during very formative childhood years, we weren't kept in mind. We weren't being able to be in existence with another. We weren't able to tolerate ourselves in the presence of an other because we learned to be with ourselves when other people can be with us in a state of comfort without having to constantly impinge or bring them into our mind. When I look up the Wikipedia for Winnicott's capacity to be alone, here's a paragraph. So I'm just kind of restating what I just said in another way to help us out here. So D.W. Winnicott, in his article of that name, Capacity to be Alone, highlighted the importance of the capacity to be alone, distinguishing it from both withdrawal and loneliness, and seeing it as derived from an internalization of the non-intrusive background presence of a mothering figure. Okay, so the mother is in the background, they're not intrusive, and we're able to bring that in to our minds. Winnicott, in his writings, always stressed the importance of the baby being allowed to just lie back and float, in quotes, and of the, quote, opportunity that the baby has to experience separation without separation, end quote. Out of those early experiences emerges this capacity to be alone in or out of the presence of others, something which might have to be reacquired later in life through psychotherapy. Okay, so think about that this importance of the baby to have the opportunity to experience separation without separation, that they're able to be separate, that they're able to be their own selves within a relationship. This is, again, why I felt the need to talk about how loneliness or to be alone is actually a relational skill. We're relational beings. We learn through relationships. We don't learn in isolation. We don't learn how to be alone by being alone. You can't throw a baby into a room, lock the door, and say you're going to learn how to be alone by being alone. Right? I mean, it doesn't work that way. And we can see how there's so many times when we are physically alone, but we can't actually tolerate being alone. We fall into this loneliness, this sense of voidness, that there actually is no good, that we're not understood, that we're not known, that we're not held, that we're alone in the world, that we're really, really alone. So we don't develop a state of being able to be alone by being forced to be alone. It just doesn't work that way. You can't throw a child into a room and expect them to develop healthy capacities of being alone. What you're going to develop in them is sheer terror, right? It's neglect, it's abuse, it's problematic, et cetera, et cetera. A child learns how to play by themselves and how to stimulate themselves and how to feel good about being alone when they're able to do that within the presence of somebody else that isn't demanding something of them. Yes, this is the theory. if this is a theory that then we're now building and we're understanding that if that's the case, then maybe when we feel really alone and lonely, when we feel lonely now as adults, it's because we're really lacking that other object, that person in our minds that loves us and that knows us, even though they're not around us. And if we can think about it this way, then maybe we can hold a lot more compassion for our loneliness and a lot more compassion for why so many of us are afraid of being alone, and why we can we can try to be alone and we can force ourselves to be alone and we can meditate all we want, but that doesn't always necessarily lead us into feeling more comfortable within ourselves. And so what's the answer, Thaís? Well, this is where self-trust and trusting of others starts to come into the picture, right? Because if loneliness is the sense of not trusting that other people are keeping us in mind, or we're not really trusting that other people can be alone in our presence, right? If we kind of think about it as loneliness is a lack of trust of self, then what follows, what we can then build an argument of, is that as we build self-trust and relational trust in other people, we start to develop an ability to be alone, and that we can kind of come to terms with and feel better about being in relationship with other people. Recently, I had a session with a client who was grappling with this idea of not really being able to trust others if we don't trust ourselves. And kind of connecting the two, that it can be really hard to trust other people, that it can be really hard to trust that people are good, or that people have our well-being in mind, that people have our backs. If we don't trust ourselves, if we don't have our own backs, if we don't believe that we are good people. Yes. And so in that conversation, I started to think, well, what if the opposite also applies? What if our ability to trust ourselves was linked to how we learned to trust others? That it's not just when I trust myself, I can trust others, but also when I trust others, I trust myself. What if those things were linked? That it's not linear, it's not A plus B equals C, but actually a complicated algorithm where trust of self and others are linked together, so that it doesn't have to look like, oh, as I love myself, I love others, but also like as I build love for others, I also love self. That love is a mutuality. That trust is a mutuality. It's a relational skill. It's a way in which we're learning and informing ourselves of how we see and perceive ourselves and the world. This again kind of dips back into a core theory of mine, which is that we learn who we are by being in relationship with other people. And this directly connects to what we've just talked about with loneliness. How we learn about ourselves, how we learn our sense of goodness, how we learn about our worth, how we learn about our intelligence, how we learn about our personality, all of that comes from being in relationship with another human. Our identity, our sense of self is born out of other people's relationship to us, both through in what we see modeled, but also how they directly relate to us and also how they relate to themselves. All of that is connected. We don't learn who we are in a vacuum. We learn who we are in the presence of others. Other people help us learn who we are. And so our ability to trust other people, that comes first. Our relationship to other people comes before our relationship to ourselves. It's just, we're seeing this in hundreds of years of psychology. We're seeing this again and again and again. It's not just a theory. I mean, we can look at it through the lens of attachment, that our relationship, our attachment to other people is what helps us to develop a sense of security within ourselves. We see this in so many different ways. Who we are is born out of our relationships. And so trusting other people to have us in mind is what allows us to develop a sense of trust that we have our own backs. So if loneliness is an absence of an internal other, then what if loneliness was a sign that we don't trust ourselves because we lacked an opportunity to trust others to be with us the way we needed them to be? What if, right? What if trust came hand in hand with our ability to be alone? And so when we think about, okay, Thaís, like I'm fucked, right? Like you're telling me that I'm fucked because I am always lonely or whatever. No, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is, if we can start to link loneliness and trust together, then we actually have very practical and kind of clear ways of moving forward, because there are so much information out in the world about trust, about building trust with others, building trust with ourselves. We can kind of work through this in our healing work, that if we have a model for how we understand loneliness and connect it to trust, then we have a clear path forward. And that's my goal with this episode, is as we start to kind of understand these pieces and maybe where it came from and how we can make sense of it, now we can take it into our healing work and we can start to make sense of it in the presence of an other. Yes? Okay. The other thing that I've been thinking about and how it all connects is, I've talked before about how people pleasing is often a way that we attempt to control people's perception of ourselves. It's manipulative, but not in like an ill-intentioned way, but in a sense that we people please because we want people to like us, which means that we contort ourselves, we behave in certain ways so that people have a good perception of us, so we can control people's perception of us. But when we try to control other people's perception of us, what we're saying is that we do not trust that they can hold us in good mind, that they can hold us in mind in a way that feels spacious and good, right? We do not trust them. We are not trusting that the other person can perceive us accurately. And I think the reason why is because we're terrified of our perception of ourselves, that we're terrified of who we are, that we're terrified that they're actually going to see who we really are, which is bad and corrupt, that we lack good people in our minds, that we lack that experience of being known by another, that we are lacking a place in which we can trust that we have our own good image in mind. And so we imagine that everybody else must have us in bad image. It just is another way in which we can then start to connect these two ideas together, trust and loneliness. That maybe when we try to control other people's perception of us, when what we're saying is that we do not trust them, and then what that means is that we're terrified of our own aloneness, of our own loneliness, of our own badness, that we are actually void of goodness. And so that means that as we start to do the work of building trust in self, while simultaneously building trust in others, we start to feel more held in the world. And that it's not as much of a dog-eat-dog world, but that people actually are good and that can hold us in goodness, and we can hold ourselves in goodness. And we start to experience more and more the capacity to be alone without diving into loneliness, or as Winnicott says also, and withdrawing from the world. Right? And this withdrawing, what Winnicott says, is I think what I was trying to hint at when I was talking at the beginning about people feeling like they actually prefer to be alone because they don't trust people, that's not emotional maturity or emotional health either. That's probably a sign that something has happened and they withdraw. We can think about this in language of attachment, because I know that that's more popular right now, right? We can talk about in terms of avoidant attachment, right? That's that withdrawing. If I disappear, if I cut off my emotional need for connection, then I can't get hurt. Yes? And we can think about that as just another form of insecure attachment. That's actually not secure attachment. Even though it may feel really good to be cut off from people, it may feel like we're doing really good, there's probably something there. Just like the other form of, that we talk a lot about in attachment theory, is anxious attachment, where we're always anxious about what other people are thinking or feeling. We can connect that directly to this idea of people pleasing, that we're just constantly surprised by or disconnected from how people must be perceiving us, that we're just like, we just don't know, and that we're anxious all the time about whether or not people are going to be there for us. And that's because we lack internally the solid experience of security. Yes? So I think I've built a pretty decent argument. Yes. Are you following me still? I really am glad to have you here still, because I know that this can get a little heady, but I think that at the core of all of this is something really useful. That the human experience is complicated. There's so many levels and layers to this, but that we're not doomed. And the more that we kind of know this and then kind of take it to our own work and digest it and munch it, that we can actually start to find ways to navigate ourselves and relationships in a way that can feel really fulfilling. And as we, continue to enter this year of pandemic, and we're not sure when it's going to end and what the other side of it is going to look like, I really implore you and invite you to continue to reach for connection and continue to reach for and do the hard work of connecting to people and staying in relationship with people, because we need each other more than ever. And you can see how we're quick to temper, right? We're really sensitive and tender right now. Everyone is very quick to being annoyed. And I really think that speaks to our isolation and our lack of connection. And yes, we need to learn how to be alone, but that comes from relationship, not by forcing ourselves to be alone. Yes? All right. Well, I'm going to wrap it up here before I confuse us even more. Let me know your thoughts on this, okay? Connect with me on Instagram at I am Thaís Sky. I love hearing from all of you. Like I said at the beginning, I have some really good episodes coming for you, and I'm glad you're here. Thanks for being here. And I will talk to you all next week.